If you're involved in the development of new products and services, then did you know that there are three main points along the journey where your idea could fail? I call these valleys of death, or I suppose you could think of them as chasms that you don't want to fall into. Interestingly, the quality of the idea or the technical proficiency is rarely the ultimate cause of failure. However, for a lot of engineering entrepreneurs and professionals, this can be the main point of focus. In this conversation with Sam Dods from Triple Chasm, we explore exactly how you can use empirical data to know exactly how much and when to deploy your valuable resources. As someone who's constantly innovating, I found this conversation to be fascinating and immeasurably valuable, and I hope that you will too. Hi, Sam.
Hi, David. Good to talk again.
Yeah, exactly. It was only a few days ago, and spurred on this idea of having a recorded chat. So, Sam, do you want to just tell us a little bit about Triple Chasm and how it's sort of come to be and your background, just for a few?
Cool. So, I mean, when we first met, it sort of became apparent that we've had something of a similar journey. You're in your startup, you're evolving a bunch of ideas, you understand your market space, you're thinking about opportunities to effectively spin out products. I did the same thing when I first came to England back in '97. Same sort of thing. We had a whole bunch of ideas, we understood these market spaces, and we were spinning out. But I sort of look back now and think, oh my God, if I'd had this framework here, we had goes of stuff and we put money behind stuff, but did it hang together that well? No. Could we have been more successful? What would the odds have been? Absolutely. So, I did that and, sold that business off into, it was a trade sale into corporate, and worked there for a while. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I left that, and about 5 years ago, I went to listen to a talk by a bloke called Uday Fadke about commercialization, this thing called this Triple Chasm model. And it's a bit like you and us talking the other day. I just listened to this thing, oh my God, this is so comprehensive. And so much of the stuff he was saying was like, yeah, I remember that. And that's what happened. So it just sort of rang lots of bells for me. So that's how I got involved in this sort of area, starting out very much like you on this journey, and you're learning hands-on, and it's pretty damn tough, some of the lessons, and you're a bit overloaded and trying to get going. But then talking to Uday, he did the same kind of thing, but he then did it lots and lots of times. He was on the West Coast, and they were investing in startups, they were doing all this stuff. But what he sort of clocked when I first met him in this thing was saying, how could we mess up in so many different ways all the time, and not just him, but everybody, and not be able to learn lessons that we could comprehensively apply to help us navigate this journey more effectively? So he'd worked with hundreds of companies that invested in quite a few of them, but he was really interested in how can we do this more effectively? There's so many good ideas out there, and we know 90% of them plus fail. But surely we can change the odds. So that's the start, which is your interest, is my interest. And I guess most of the audience listening, if they're early stage looking at that, they're going to be thinking the same thing. How do we sort of up the odds? And that's how I got involved in the Triple Chasm model, is the research underpinning that. So Uday spent about 10 years looking at 3,000 products going to market at different stages of the journey. And this is the Triple Chasm model. So
it's
that's how I got there.
I've been involved in innovation my whole career. Started with composite materials and trying to introduce lots of new products, and more of them fail than succeed. And I sort of stumbled on this idea, which I'm certain wasn't my idea, but called the Valley of Death.
Yes.
And I've even done talks to to university students about the Valley of Death, and it intuitively made sense to me that there are points at which it's easy to get investment. There are points which it's easy to get people on board. It's points where it's easy to prove a concept, and it's cheap to do that. But if you don't bring the right people along at the right time, then you can end up locking yourself out, because if people don't have skin in the game, then they kind of go, well, I've not invented here syndrome. But the bit I really didn't know until recently, through talking to you, was the fact there are 3 valleys of death specifically, and that's what we'll go through, and the fact that each valley has different properties. And if you understand those valleys and you prepare for them in advance, then they can be opportunities to get yourself well set up rather than actually valleys of death.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't have to be such a negative thing. So do you want to pull up some slides, Sam?
Yeah,
We'll
cool.
go through.
Absolutely. So the first thing I'd say is, so I talked about how Uday first got involved in this research, which was basically common stuff to what we've experienced too, and lots of others. But what he did first, he actually delivered an entrepreneurship program at, I can't remember which university. One of his colleagues was heading off for a year, so we got a bunch of slides, and he started doing some research before doing his looking at a 3,000 product. So what's the thinking out there? And he just looked at lots and lots of literature, and he sort of observed there's sort of 7 schools of thought looking at this journey. So you got lots of entrepreneurship stuff, don't we? How many posts do we read about the sort of hero entrepreneur? And it's all through the lens of the entrepreneur and their psychological makeup and what's the difference. Useful stuff, but it doesn't cover everything. Then you got like technology management, technology mapping. That's another sort of lens. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are all fairly things that we've heard about. Basically, there's lots of different perspectives. But what he clocked at the start of the journey is that there's lots of different ways of looking at this journey, and they've all seemed to have some of the story and there's something useful. But what's actually required is something that integrates all of it, because otherwise, how do I make sense of all this sort of stuff? So that was I think his first step before looking at the 7,000.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at this retrospectively, from a position of success, right?
Yeah.
And I often reflect on this, like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Stephen Bartlett, all these people who are successful. They go, I was successful because business strategy approaches. That was it. I was successful because I'm a great entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I have my own approach. This idea of a holy trinity, the three basic things you need, which is timing, people, and idea. And if you don't have those 3 things, then it's going to be really challenging. You're going to need to survive a long time before you get all 3 in place. But I think really what we're talking about now is a sort of a proactive approach where you almost take all of this off the cards. It doesn't matter, right? Because if you understand what you need to put in place before, then you just put those things in place. I think the timing is just the one that you've got to be right on your timing, and that's probably
exactly. But I mean, to pick up on your point, I mean, there are lots of different ways of looking at it. They've all got useful aspects, but we're all different. Our ideas are all different. They can all have different routes to market, and our strategic differentiation can be all different too. We can have similar offerings, but maybe I understand the market space way better than you. My product might be not quite as good as yours, but that's my advantage. Or I might have a leadership style that's out of the. I mean, everybody wants to listen to me talk all the time. So the idea that he was clocking was the phrase he used was strategic diversity. Let's not obsess over what Google did or they did. I mean, everybody's done their own story, and you can't duplicate what they've done because there are so many different moving parts. So that's back to that point. That's what triggered the research into the 3,000 product. So he was entrepreneur in residence at the Judge Business School in Cambridge at the time, and he kicked it off just starting locally. They started talking to more and more companies in China, on the West Coast, everywhere, across all sectors. And so I'm just going to talk you briefly through that. And then the upshot of that is the sort of tools and programs that can help people on this journey. So I'm just going to look at 6 different elements briefly. One is commercialization maturity. So is there some measure about how far along the journey I am? And you've already mentioned TRL. So NASA did that founding work back in the 90s. So what kind of metric can we have along there? And then what on the journey, what are all the different things that we need to think about? So this is what we call the mesoeconomic vectors. So there are lots of different factors. Like all those different factors, like raising funding, building teams, so employees, all these different factors have different metrics, don't they? So, I mean, for my team, it could be full-time equivalent employees. For funding, it could be dollars or pounds. So what he also developed was a metric to cover all of it. So now I can work with this thing in an integrated way. And then when you pull all that together, then you can describe the full commercialization journey, which I'll touch on then. And this is mostly the startups that we work with. That's when their ears properly prick up, because then you start seeing what should I be thinking at different stages of the journey to up my chance. I thought I'd touch very briefly on sustainability. So the overlay that we've got to sort of that uses this framework, and then just touch on the sort of tools and programs. And I've already shared one of the tools with you, so that's something that everybody can access. So if I just touch on this idea of maturity first, so this is the chart I always love most, because this is 3,000 products at different stages of the journey mapped onto one chart. And at the start, the thinking was, well, if I want to talk about growth, what's the best metric? And we were talking about fundraising before, maybe a little bit of an overemphasis on it these days. You could imagine revenue raised, but hold on, does revenue raised really signify growth? How often does lots of revenue investment raise result in failed companies too? So that's not that useful. But there are lots of other metrics and revenue, but revenue doesn't cut until later in the journey. And how does that track to success? So in the end, having looked at all the different factors, there was, I mean, it seems fairly obvious now, but customers. How many customers have you got is the best metric of commercialization, basically. So he looked at that, and then this idea of the sort of S curve that you grow your market, you get more and more customers, and there's sort of an end point. There's a sort of maximum number of customers. He was thinking about that and thinking, well, how could I look at all the different products, from an aero engine, which could take decades, or some new therapeutic, down to fashion, which could take one season or something like that? How could I collapse this all onto one chart? Being very much aware that, the time to the maximum number of customers, we'd all understand stuff like fashion and retail. 1 or 2 years, it's history, isn't it? I mean, 20 years time, I mean, that's forgotten about basically. But if you're looking in aerospace, some new bits of equipment, it could take decades. Literally, pharma could take decades. So the time to journey, this journey to maximum number, is vastly different. So what was come up with to collapse everything onto the same chart was, why don't we take customers divided by the maximum number of customers? So I'm just going from 0 to 1. And then for the time to the then the time to the maximum number of customers collapses down to 1 as well. So now, whether it's an aero engine or some new bit of fashion, I can look at all that data, and that's the data. That quite literally is the data that was extracted, and you can see it's a bit messy and there's a spread, but there's definitely a trend. So across all, often different. We're on the West Coast, we're different. We're in China, we're different. But actually, when you collapse all the market spaces and all the regions, there is quite a theme there, basically. And that's what you can see on that chart.
So when you're talking about customers, that's obviously assuming you've got a product. So does this start at the point where you proved, you have, even if it's at a prototype stage, you have something where you can give it to somebody and somebody is prepared to give you some money for it? Or are we earlier than that, where someone's prepared just to try something? Where does this start?
This is at the earliest stage of I've done a PhD in some area, and I've got some science, and I've got some vague idea of a concept of something that somebody might buy, basically. So very, very sort of early on.
0.0001.
Yeah, exactly.
Ratio. As a ratio, okay.
So skipping over that time, so just getting rid of all the dots, basically. So we had that on a log scale, basically. So we're trying to really emphasize at the very early stages. Clearly, on the right hand side, on the linear scale, you can see this is closer to what people refer to as the S curve that lots of people talk about products going to market. But what I've highlighted here is the 3 chasms that you mentioned. So that was, who was it? It was Geoffrey Moore in the 90s, wasn't it? Crossing the Chasm. And what he was describing there was Chasm 3. But if I just describe very briefly, what do we mean? So in the data, what it became apparent was at 3 points in this journey, customer numbers froze and some companies failed. This is typically where they failed, at these chasms. So Chasm 1 was Can I make a prototype? I've got some amazing new science that I've discovered, but can I actually translate that into a prototype? And also, once I've crossed Chasm 1, it also implies that I have some initial validation of what we call a proto customer. So it could be a mate, it could be people that just sort of like the stuff. It's not a mainstay customer that delivers, that expects perfect delivery of the offering. So that is Chasm 1, and the vast majority of businesses make it through that, basically, because normally if you're thinking about your science, you're already thinking about the prototype. So that
I think this is an interesting one when I look at it from my experience. I think because of the propensity to venture capitalism and investor funding, a lot of people skip over Chasm 1. Because they talk a sufficiently good game, maybe with a proof of concept that's a model or doesn't have any of the back end stuff, or the really tricky bit, but it looks about right. And I'm thinking about, I work a lot in energy and infrastructure, and some concepts are great, but they might be incredibly capital intensive to build. So I'm going to build a wind turbine, but it's just going to be a small one, because I can't afford to. I can't afford to build a 20 megawatt offshore wind turbine. So I've got this concept. I might be speaking from real experience here. Really good concept. I've proved it at a small scale. I've done all the aerodynamics. I've done all the modeling. I've got the interest. I've got the grant. I've got some developers interesting. I might consider myself to have crossed Chasm 1 and think, right, well, I'm going to build a company around this, but I need investment. So I've talked to a sufficiently good game to bring an investor around. But what I've not realized is that, the way that offshore wind is funded, for example, is not necessarily motivated by a good idea. They're motivated by what an insurance company considers to be risk.
Yes, exactly.
And that kills it, and the reason we need to be honest with ourselves is you need to take your time in Chasm 1. Because if you're supposed to fail, it's not necessarily, it's about framing. It might not be a bad thing. If you fail at Chasm 1, you've probably not invested too much blood, sweat and tears into it. You're not going to lose your house, and you've got time to then do something different. So these are positives as well as negatives, aren't they, when we look at failures?
I mean, remember what we're going to come to later, but we talked through the other day when we looked at these vectors and we looked at market space, and we were looking at the difference between the successful companies and the ones that weren't successful. And the biggest difference was the successful companies pre-Chasm 1 were already looking at the market space, how it operates in terms of a value chain, framing themselves and all the competitors. So that's stuff that you're talking about there. How does does offshore wind behave? If you thought about that early enough, you would say, shit, even though technically this is a brilliant solution, all the infrastructure and the way the market behaves, I would need to severely disrupt it. And disruption can be cool, but it's difficult and it takes years and you get lots of resistance. So you will sometimes make a decision very early. If you look across all these vectors, particularly understanding the market space, particularly for the likes of us, a bunch of scientists and engineers, you tend to go look at the technology and how do I protect and build a product. No, heads up. How is the market behaving? Because if you don't think about that, this beautiful concept can just go on and on for a while till it dies. It meets the reality of the market space out there. So absolutely bang on. So that's Chasm 1, and then Chasm 2 is the biggie. That's where I can't remember the figures, but the vast majority of them fail at Chasm 2. And all you've got to do at Chasm 2 is build a viable business model, which means basically I need to nail everything. I need to nail everything about revenue generation. How does the money come in sort of what shape and what ways? And we know in media and stuff like that, 20 years ago, there are so many different ways of advertising and getting different forms of revenue. But here, more likely is I need to have even nailed my manufacturing. So prototyping is cool, but how am I going to make 100,000 of these or 1,000,000 of them? And what balance do I need? So the business model just suddenly brings in everything, and that's the big struggle. Once I've nailed that, and you're talking about investors and the likes of venture capitalists, they'll normally want you to be somewhere around having nailed that, because they're going to invest in your business model effectively then. And then Chasm 3 is channels to market. It is all the stuff about, okay, good, I've got a business model that works now, I just need to churn it, and how do I contact as many customers as possible and get them on board? So Chasm 2 is the big one. And if you look at I mean, not just the UK, in general, we do lots of work with accelerators and stuff around Chasm 1. So but it's very technically focused and TRL sort of focused. We do very little around Chasm 2 when everybody's failing. And the investors ideally don't want to get involved till you've actually validated your business model. But God, it takes so much effort to do that. It's
I think that's why we're so great in the UK at innovating and so useless in the UK at actually getting products to market, which is what ultimately puts the bottom line in UK PLC.
Yes.
And this is what pricked my ears up. It's critical, I think, to have something that goes beyond the end of the technology readiness levels.
Yeah.
That's like, I've got it, I can make it, it's brilliant. It's and that's all we seem to talk about up to this point. And so we need to change that conversation.
Absolutely. So I mean, that's the fundamentals underlying it. And just quickly, just to touch back on stuff, because people may be looking at this through the eyes of like Rogers. So the original talk about S curves and early adopters, all that language about different sorts of customer, that's based on the diffusion equation. So bang, this blue line here, halfway through the journey, you got half your number of customers. So it's just a normal distribution, and he just did standard deviation. So it's not real, but it's a pretty good approximation of how products go out to market. But then Bass came along a bit later and said, well, actually, I think it's a bit slower, building the customer numbers. So that's the green line. And then Uday Phadke and team came along, and that's the purple line. That's the actual data of 3,000 products. And guess what? Halfway through the journey, you've got less than 10% of your customers. And that's the truth. That's the real data. And that's the thing where often we're getting leaned on as startup people by investors, rather saying, well, why aren't you further along? You should have more of this. Well, because it doesn't happen like that. It takes this long, and then it's very steep growth after that.
And that's
a fundamental lesson.
It's so exciting to know, because that's the hard work. You've put 5-6 years in, and people are going, God, look at you.
Yes.
Look at your order book. You've only got £1 million, blah blah blah. But knowing that you've still got 90% of your customers out there, and you're doing the hard work up front is inspiring. So I think that's a really great.
Yeah, and it takes the pressure of people very early. Say this is the reality of it. So, and then you can sort of look backwards and go, well, okay, if I'm at that journey, wow, that's only 5% of my customers that I'm dealing with here. So, you can use this data, this trend in various from various perspectives. But that's okay. So that benchmarks against the stuff that people may have heard of. So what we've then done is taken those three big chasms on the journey and subdivided with ×3 to come up with the commercialization readiness level. But that was based, so Uday was in contact with some of the team at NASA when they did their work back in the 90s. So it was taking that sort of thinking. But what we have to keep reminding people is NASA don't want to go and sell lots of stuff and commercialize it. They built this to put technology in space. That's cool. I mean, it's absolutely perfect for that journey, for that outcome. And now we've got all these something RLs, all these market RL. I mean, there are so many of them now that are weird modifications, not with any data underpinning them, but just trying to use this. But what we've done using that real data and the TRL, we can map the two of them together. And what you can see is TRL is very useful in the early stage and crossing Chasm 1. But don't be running around Yahooing when you reach TRL 9, because you can effectively put your technology in space. You've got a prototype that's been validated, but that's nothing like having commercialized something yet. So you are quite literally halfway through the journey, basically. So the very simple equation, CRL is roughly equal to TRL divided by 2. So that is probably the most important factor that came out of this research. And this is the stuff that we're talking to the likes of Innovate UK and stuff like that, to have a standard language for everybody. It makes it so much easier if we're all on the same page, if investors and everybody, all the players are on the same page saying the same thing. Because if I say that seed or Series A, Series B, that means, we think it means the same thing. It means completely different things. It does not describe where these people are on the journey, whereas CRL does describe. And in the next stage,
this enables the likes of Innovate UK to put products and support services in place to get people up to CRL 10. Because at the moment, if they don't have the language, they can't do it. And my experience is, where are you in the TRL scale?
Absolutely.
I'm expecting this project to go from 3 to 6.
Yeah.
At which point I'll cross Chasm 1, but there's no language beyond there.
Yes.
You expect by the time you're at 9, you're selling 1 million widgets into a car manufacturer, and you're sitting on your yacht.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, NASA had one customer, which was
the
US government. So they hit 1-to-1 fine at Chasm 1, but the rest of us don't have that luxury. So
exactly.
It's
so that's I mean, an equivalent would be us trying to be all working together on building industrial capability, on building commercialization success, with meetings with 10 people speaking 10 different languages. We're all saying our stuff. We all think we're on the same page, but we're actually saying completely different things. So no wonder things just don't hang together that well. So that's the first point, and that's probably the most fundamental, that we have this underpinning description of the journey. Well, we've got a metric that describes it, but then you think, well, okay, great, so that's sort of useful, but still at these different stages, what do I need to think about is the next question. So what do I actually do? I'm on this journey. Well done, Sam. I'm at CRL 3 now, and what should I actually do? What should I be focusing on? So that's what I'll talk about next. So in the research, looked at 154 different considerations in looking at the 3,000 products, which was a complete overload. I can't think about that, about 154. So he used Kamey's clustering to collapse them down to 12 different, what he calls mesoeconomic vectors. So meso meaning somewhere between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Where the rubber hits the road, this is how do we actually get this stuff working, and in vectors very specifically having direction too. So 12 different levers that we can pull on the journey. So I'm just going to touch on those very briefly. So these 12 different levers, they're grouped into what we call external vectors, internal vectors, and then the composites bringing it all together. So by external, what we mean is these are considerations that you don't have control over, or you have very limited control over, but you absolutely must understand them.
Yeah.
You must, for example, market spaces, I must ensure I understand how my proposition will work within that market space value chain. So that's external. Internal, I have much more control over. This is my science and technology, my IP management, all that sort of stuff. And the composite is, how do I bring these all together? So if I just super briefly touch on them, and I mean, if you want to pull any one of them out in particular, just give us a yell. So market spaces, that market space that I'm going to sell into, often what we find, this is the hardest point when we run programs for startups to get, because they think more like supply chain management, that I'm sitting here, what comes before me, whatever, and we say, forget that you exist, forget that your proposition exists. If I'm looking at therapeutics, or I'm looking at whatever, how does it behave? Think of it like a value chain. So therapeutics might be early stage, wet lab work, and then clinical trials, all the way through to deployment and the patients. At every stage, there's value adding work, and that bit has to happen before that, and you can have circle backs, but how does that market operate? Because you're going to need to make sure that in the next step, that I can map myself into where am I adding value? Where am I operating? Where are my competitors operating? Where are potential partners operating? What regulations apply at these different stages? So it's to get you to really understand that market space. And bringing it back to what you said before, you will sometimes decide, even though my science, this stuff could evolve into a beautiful product, I'm not going to do it because this doesn't work. Or you might say, what I sell to my customer, my product, might be vastly different. Because I can
Yeah.
take my science into different sorts of products. So I'm going to shape my product around being able to fit into this market space. Yeah. So that's proposition
Yeah,
framing.
and this is so fundamental, especially when we look at the modern world where things are changing so rapidly.
Yes.
You know, you can't look at today's marketplace. I think I gave you the analogy last week about, teaching a toddler to skateboard.
Yeah.
And, you can sit there with your knowledge that you've got and you can probably teach a toddler to skateboard, but that child is going to grow and they're going to learn how they learn how to do what you can teach them.
Yeah.
And unless you are skateboarding yourself, it's not going to take long before you've got nothing else to teach them, because the
Yes.
products, they're moving so quickly. And this is something we're spending a lot of time on, is making sure we are developing, in our case, testing services and know-how and knowledge, for what people are going to need in 2 or 3 years' time. And
Yeah.
it's probably our central activity beyond
Yeah.
doing the actual testing, is saying, what should we be developing? Where
Yeah.
should we should be putting our attention? So yeah, but it's
And
external. I can't control
I
it,
mean,
and it's a guess to an extent, isn't it?
yeah. And like years ago, when market spaces and their behavior was fairly static, okay, you just map it out and you sort of fit in. I got a 10-year strategy, bang, bang, bang. But now we use this term disruption and stuff. So when the actual market space is disrupting in front of your eyes and changing, and how's it going to sit? Wow, now it's complicated. So if you look in, outside of your area, say you look at alternative proteins. How's that going to look in 5 or 10 years? So I've got something that is in the early stage. Maybe I've got some kind of feed to grow cells and but how's that market space going to behave in 10 years' time? So now we're getting super complex, and that's where this stuff is really useful. So we'll say we get more investors that focus in specific areas like alternative protein. So what we say to them is, you need to understand the different ways the market space might play out more than anybody else, because then you're going to be deciding not just on the science, but how you see the product fitting into one of these alternative futures that you see out there. This is the hardest job and the most important.
If it only fits into one of the 4 futures, then potentially, have another thing. But if it fits into 3 out of 4, then that's great.
Absolutely. I mean, if you come into like you touched on sort of EV and stuff like that last time, if you go right back, like if you look at the whole ecosystem that's required, I need charge points, I need all these things, this whole thing, how's it going to play out? Who's going to be doing what? So my offering now needs to sit in some story that I think it's going to look like, basically. Maybe I can influence it, maybe I can't, but yeah. So we don't overemphasize, but that is super important. And that, when we're working with startups, is the point that most of them freeze. That's the hardest. Often, I mean, you're in your market space, so you know it relatively well anyway. But can you imagine, I've just done a PhD in some area, and I've got some amazing science, but I've never really thought about market spaces. That's
what is the most fascinating is I was on a call with a customer yesterday, and I asked him specifically. I said, "Listen, we want to make sure we're here for you in 5 years' time. What do you think we should be looking at?" He just turned around and he said, "Dave, I think you're probably the best person to answer that question." He doesn't know. He knows kind of vaguely what he'll be doing in 2 years' time, but he has to build it. He has to go from twisted pair testing to motorette testing to stator testing, and we kind of help with all of that. But then beyond that, he's not got one, so he's not had to test it. And it's not just test it, will it work? It's test it, will it work based on future power requirements, and. So it really is. It's like we're all learning to skateboard together.
Absolutely.
It's just as the service provider or product provider, you need to spend more time skateboarding than the customer, so you kind of know what they know before they know it. Tricky.
And it's bloody tricky because the amount of investment to develop some of these things is huge. So you think a national industrial strategy might include something like a center for EV development where all the different sorts of things you need to look at are in here, and there's massive investment. So I can come along with my new idea, and I can come into the center, and I've got an environment I can work in and test it.
Yeah.
So it's super critical. And if you're a small business trying to think about that, it is so hard to also stay focused and to think, my God, I could go like there and there and there, and to think, where is our secret sauce? Yeah. So yeah, that's the market space, proposition framing, customer definition. So there's a whole typology there. It's not super complex at the top level. It's direct to consumer, direct to business, direct to government, because all of them have different numbers. So remember, number of customers. If I'm selling to government, I might have 1, 2, or 3, or half a dozen customers. Think about the vaccines and stuff like that. If I'm thinking consumer, it's tens of millions. If I'm thinking business, but the importance of that is I need to understand the mindset of that group. So there's a whole set of tool under there to sort of understand the customer. And the fourth one often comes in a bit later: distribution, marketing, and sales. Okay, I know my customer. I know how the market behaves. I know my customer and how they behave. How do I get to as many customers as easily as possible? Because people often say, I'm going to set up a website and like advertise it, or I'm going to phone lots of people, or I'm going to, yeah, you could do all that. But are there channels to market you can use? Are there groups that already sell stuff into that market space and contact them where you could be a bolt onto them? So really thinking thoroughly around how, because this is Chasm 3 thinking here.
Yeah.
How do I really ramp stuff now, basically, as efficiently as possible?
You've had your low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's looking out there, and I've sort of emphasized that a bit because often we see that's the stuff that the engineers and scientists focus least on. This is where they're more comfortable. Here's my science. Here's my technology. How do I deploy it? My IP management strategy. IP, remember, it's not just patents. We overemphasize that. It's know-how. It's all the stuff that you talked about last time. So there's a whole bunch of unregistered rights, all that sort of stuff under there. My product and service. It's not the same as my science. What's my customer actually going to pay for? That's normally the question that gets people to think, I've got some science here, I've done my PhD, but what's a customer specifically going to buy off you? Then once I've nailed that,
that's a horror show for the engineer, because we get so caught up in how good this idea is, and we know it's going to save the world, or it's going to be the best thing since sliced bread, or whatever, but people aren't prepared to pay for it. The value of something is what someone's prepared to pay for it. And potentially in those early stages, you get the early adopters, and they understand it as well, and they're prepared to pay a premium. And so,
I mean, and it's super important. Like we talk about this sort of 9-layer model, from base technologies through platforms, applications, and tools to services. Where is your offering sit? Like we did a work with base technology, was a knowledge graph database, so a new type of database. Absolutely a base technology that could go in 1,000 different ways, but that layer means all sorts of things, and it means all sorts of things across what teams I need, what expertise I need. So what are you actually going to take out there is super important. So under each of these vectors, there's a whole bunch of separate tools that we typically walk teams through. So product, and then once I've nailed that, how do I manufacture and deploy it? And I mean, you'll know this stuff, but if you've just come straight out of your PhD, like if you say to somebody, well, how are you going to make $1 million? How are you going to get them to your customers? Who's going to support it when it goes wrong? Those questions? I mean, do I need to make new sorts of tooling for the manufacturing, or is there existing tooling? I mean, there is so much to think about there. So prototyping, as you're saying, that's cool. I've lashed something together, but how do I get that actually manufactured and deployed? So that's the key. Next one, human capital. What sort of team do I need? You can imagine all sorts of different approaches where I need very, very big teams. I need teams of very specialist areas that need to interrelate in a certain way with our suppliers. So there's a whole bunch of thinking around there. And then the one that everybody jumps to, which is what we were talking about the other day about funding and investment. How do I actually fund this thing? And the general advice being always is get to customer money and learning as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
For some people, it's impossible. For some sectors, for some therapeutic stuff, you just cannot circumnavigate all the work you need to do and all the regulatory stuff. So you absolutely have to get investment. But often there are ways you can do stuff that just minimizes that investment or postpones it. And non-recurrent engineering. Can I actually charge a customer to develop something that actually helps them doing it, but it helps us on the journey too, basically? So there's a whole bunch of lessons under there. And that,
I think it's that urgency, isn't it? I think a lot of people, I'm guilty of it, and I fight against it. This kind of urgency for grandeur, for something being bigger than it is, and you kind of everywhere you look, I suppose it's the adult equivalent of the Instagram problem, where young girls everywhere they look, they're seeing these perfect, funny, intelligent, beautiful girls, and they're thinking, "Blimey, I don't match up." And it's the same thing in the corporate world. But actually, I choose to ask myself the kind of questions: why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Why do I like it? What's the purpose? What's the counterfactual? If I get some people involved with money at the wrong time, I end up basically defeating the object, which I got into this because I was excited about the technology, and I was excited about being involved and having a positive impact on people's lives. Going into the lab and saying, listen, nothing's more important than your peace of mind.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I've prematurely gone, haven't got the customers, have convinced the investor that I do. And now all of a sudden I'm saying to employees, listen, you need to deliver, you need to get out there. The pressure is real, and I think that financial capital thing, you're right. You need investment at a certain point if you want to go big. I think no one's career lasts long enough if you try and do it purely organically.
Absolutely.
Get the timing right and think about it, and
absolutely. And so I mean, and then investment comes all these different shapes, doesn't it? So angel investors, and for you to do your due diligence and make sure you've got the right sort of investor and at the right time. I mean, angels come in not just with money, but if they know your market space and they've been on the journey a few times, they roll up their sleeves, they can have a massive impact. I mean, they can really help you move. The VCs more typically want to come in a bit later, when you're getting towards Chasm 2 and stuff like that. I mean, that can be really helpful too, but they're more about the money, and if their operating thing is they want a 5+2, so from the start of this fund to the end has to be 7 years, they're on a journey. And I mean, they're not going to try and bullshit you. They have to be exiting at a certain point, so they're going to be leaning on you to deliver on those kind of exits. So if your journey, like we saw T-Max, is 15 years and you're 3 years in, there's no point in getting a VC who needs to exit very, very quickly. It just, so all parties need to make sure that they're on the same journey. And once you get investors on board, it's like, it's probably more than getting married or something like that. There is no escape. So be absolutely transparent, be clear, be excited about what you're doing, but also show all the stuff that all your concerns and things. Just work very openly with angels and investors.
I think so. In the game of life, I think out of all of this, I-16 is the most important decision I think any entrepreneur can make.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the externals and internals. And now when you bring it all together, the strategic positioning, this is this phrase that I used before about strategic diversity. So across those internals and externals, what is my differentiator? So for lots of the tech university spin-outs, they'll just go straight to I1. Oh my God, I've got this new science, nobody else has got it. I've got patents coming out of my ears, and that could genuinely be it. Other people might say, well, actually, I haven't got any patents, I haven't got that, but I understand the market space unbelievably well, and I can see where it's going and where we're slotting in, and I've got a product. Maybe it's not the best in the world, but I know how to get into that market. So I'm just naming some examples, but don't obsess over what Google did or what these other, which is typically what we hear a lot, just case studies. And then you think, oh, God, I'm not as good at that one. No. Look across all these areas, then be realistic, Where am I super strong? Which are the things that I can really, differentiate it? I've got to do a bit of everything, but what's my real sweet spot here?
Well, that was the question that I had. Are there some which are unavoidable, or is it the case that if you could maybe do a weighting and a rating, if you could hit over a certain score across the board, then you're kind of all right? I suppose maybe you'll talk about that later. I don't know,
but we're going to get onto the ratings, and maybe the charts on the whole journey and what matters when. That's when we'll sort of touch on that. But I think the important thing here for people listening in is don't obsess over they did it that way or they did it this way, or you get these inward visiting groups come to Cambridge because this is the most amazing ecosystem. We want to copy your ecosystem. You can't just copy what other people did. You need to think about your strengths and be super realistic. Don't say I'm brilliant at everything. What are you genuinely good at or super interested in and going to really develop? And that's what strategic positioning is about. And then the final one, bringing it all together. You can imagine the big monster spreadsheet with the financial model. How's the money going to come in? How's it going to go out? And how do we generate a profit and or meet all the other objectives that we're trying to achieve in sort of people, planet, and profit? So those are the vectors, basically. So those are the 12 things to think about on the journey. And now we're going to bring this all together. But just before I do, one of the points is you can see on each of those, there could be different things, different metrics, couldn't there? So for funding, it could be dollars and pounds. For the team, it could be full-time equivalent employees, all different metrics. So what was also required was a single metric, so you could use this as an integrated tool. So we've got this metric called commercialization intensity, which is its relevance at this point or in the target to you, times the execution effectiveness. How well are you actually doing this? And we'll touch on this shortly. And that generates this. So now look, here's the 12 vectors. So this is an assessment of a product at a certain point of its journey. And you can now see market space. So highly relevant. They're not that, they're quite good at doing that. So you get this commercialization intensity. So now we've just got a metric that we can use. So now we know how to measure how far we are on the journey. We also know about the different levers we can pull, and we've got some metric across them. But let's pull that all together now, and I'm going to jump straight down here. So across the top, we've got the journey. So we've got the CRLs with the chasms. Down here, we've got all of the different vectors, and these bars are the commercialization intensity average for all 3,000 products on the journey. So the big black bars mean this had a huge intensity, so this is very important, basically. So normally when people first look at this, it's like, oh my God, there's too much to look at. But as soon as you zoom in, you go, God, that's obvious. So does my science and technology matter right early on? Absolutely it does. Does my IP strategy, not just patents, but just having a strategy matter? Absolutely it does matter. Yeah, so you can just pull out some bits that are very important. Remember I touched on Chasm 2? Lots of black bars everywhere, particularly down the bottom here. Once you're getting into team, funding, strategic position, but basically everything matters. That's why lots of companies fail. And then look at Chasm 3, just picking out a few. Suddenly, distribution, marketing, and sales is absolutely 100. Because now I'm just trying to get channels. I'm just trying to onboard as many customers as possible. Does my science and technology matter so much anymore? No. I've nailed that. I've turned that into a product. That's in the background now.
Yeah, all that stuff sorted. Stop fiddling with it. You can damage things.
Absolutely. So you can see Chasm 1, there are high points and low points. Chasm 3, there are high and low points. Chasm 2 is the one where just about everything has got a high intensity, basically. So that's what people find sort of interesting, and people often say, yeah, well, that's fairly obvious. That's what I've, if they've worked for a while, they go, yeah, I sort of recognize that. Lots of consultants, they go, yeah, that's. So the next thing, this is probably the most useful slide that we find.
On this slide, before you move on, was this data generated through interviewing the people who got these products to market. So it was a result of the 3,000 products that found their way to a mass market appeal, right? But what about
this is Uday and team actually interviewing and looking across all those different 154 different factors at the time, basically, and then collapsing that down into this. Absolutely. So quite a heavy duty bit of work to try and see the patterns. And I mean, if you look at stuff like commercialization intensity, you think, oh my God, it's just a scale of 100 and it's 10 times 10. It's like, it's not perfect. It's not dollars, but it does give you, and there is a sound basis of an economist quite a while ago to use that. The important thing is that we finally have a metric across everything that we can look at, basically. So that's the average data. But the next step is, now we're all thinking, well, so what should I focus on? What's the difference between the successful companies? And to be clear, there were 304 successful companies out of that cohort of about 3,000. So pretty much 10%, which is pretty much the standard everywhere, isn't it? So we just simply subtracted the average off the successful companies. So these green highlighted boxes are where the successful companies had a higher commercialization intensity than the average. So this is the difference. And this is the bit that why I was emphasizing the first two external vectors, because what jumps out at you straight away, prior to Chasm 1, the successful businesses put a lot of effort into understanding their market spaces and framing themselves again. They've only just got a vague idea of the product, and they're already thinking about what does this market space look like, which circles right back to what you were saying at the start, wasn't it? You know, sometimes you'll actually shut down and say, that product, no, that's not going to work because the market's looking like this, or it will look like that. So
that's the key that I was touching on before as well, in terms of, you know, if you look at the Apple and the Microsofts of this world, it's easy to look back and hypothesize over why they were successful, but you don't have the counterfactual. Once you bring in the failed companies, then you start saying, okay, the difference was that they had a good company, they had a good product, but they also knew who was going to buy it, and, you know, why they were going to buy it, and the shape of the market that they were selling into. And that's the key, is doing that up front and saving yourself time. You know, you only have one or two careers, maybe. It's not a thing if you don't get the right answer on the market from the best idea in the world. It gives you an opportunity to do something else, and
exactly.
By the time you get to point 10 and then fail in count 3, because actually you messed up and didn't do the job in 0 to 3 stages. That's really key information.
So that's a good point too. Is like, so now people are watching and thinking, well, what can I do differently? Is because I'm saying lots of the programs we run focus on Chasm 2 because that's the big hole. But the question is, it's just like, oh my God, I might as well give up because it's so difficult. No, as early as possible, hit these, like, understand your market space well before you get there. Try and do all the homework, all the preparation. So when you get to Chasm 2, you've nailed so much of the stuff already. We work quite a few years, and they're at Chasm 2, and they're trying to understand their market space. And oh my God, it's such an overload, basically. So the lesson here is, do as early as possible these things that you can do.
I know we don't want to labour this point too heavily, but you know, it's difficult actually when you're at the early stage and you've got all the clever people doing the engineering and it's tangible, right? It feels like they're earning their day's pay at the end of the day, because today they've made a new program and it does something really clever, and isn't that great? And you're sitting there as they maybe in more of a management role or a strategic role, been thinking about the market space, and you haven't even got a product, and it feels not that helpful, right? But it's nice to know that actually you're doing a valuable job, because it means that when they do hit the final winning button, you know exactly what you're going to do with that button at that point. and maybe shrink the length of the chasm.
Yeah. Well, because you know then exactly what the gap is in that market that your product's going to slot into. You know what the need is. So you're shaping your product to fit what's required out there in general terms. And that's so important. Otherwise, if we're engineers and scientists, and both of us are, you just keep building stuff because you think it should be required that way. The world doesn't behave that way. Markets don't behave that way. It's not always rational and logical. You have to fit in there. You might better influence markets over time, but at the start, must understand them. But yeah, so that's the biggest lesson is prepare early and particularly understand your market space. But if you look right down at business models, remember we said Chasm 2, that's when it all matters. So don't even be worrying about business models too early. I mean, like if you're at CR 1, 2, 3, no, understand the market space. You'll think about that later because I can't do everything. You're a tiny team early on. You can't do it all. So do what's actually super important at the right time. By Chasm 2, you've normally grown a bigger team. But then you can be clear. So you're responsible for this area. You're thinking about that. This team is sorting this out. That so you can make sure that you're nailing all the stuff. But if you've already prepared the market space, all that stuff you understand, this is going to be Chasm 2 will be a hell of a lot easier, and your odds of success and crossing it are way better. And one other point too is, if you get investors in it, stuff like that, try not to be locked into a business model around Chasm 2 because Uday found that on average, the companies bounced backwards and forwards about 5 or 6 times. So I think I've nailed my business model on how I'm going to charge and everything. And then you try it out with some customers, what we call charter customers, and it's not quite working and stuff. Okay, so let's evolve, let's change this, or if we manufacture it that way and it fits in this way, it can be, and just so you have to bounce backwards and forwards a few times. So make sure you've got the flexibility to evolve. Not to be locked in. Yeah, that's it. And I mean, that's basically, that's the biggest lesson. I'll touch very briefly in terms of sustainability, covering environment, social, and economic. There's an overlay here. So this rigorous framework gives you a way of really doing this thoroughly. So this is based on looking at the macroeconomic approaches and then building this into the framework. And finally, out of all that stuff, what we've evolved is a set of tools for different sorts of players. So for the actual startups, and you've got that navigator tool now. So that's a very entry-level tool. We've got the workbench, much more thorough, and there's a lot of tools. It's sort of like SWOT analysis on steroids. So there's loads of tools underpinning every one of those vectors to help people think through stuff. And then we've developed a bunch of programs for the different stages. So remember, we were looking at this before. So these early stages, you probably hear terms like sprints and hackathons, stuff like that. We've got some of these tools will support me on this journey, but we've got programs there. We've got programs. These are typically called accelerators, crossing Chasm 1, and this is where we put most of our effort into, I guess, is the Chasm 2 crossing. So we've got a range of different offerings there that use this underpinning triple chasm model to actually help companies.
Yeah, and to be clear, from my understanding of this is, what you're looking to do is get in with the likes of Innovate UK and other research funding bodies and provide this kind of service on a big scale to large groups of people, because that's what I think. If anyone can do, if they listen to this and think, well, that's brilliant, I want some of that. Obviously, we can put your information up and they can get in touch with you directly. But I plan to get in touch with UKRI and other organisations I'm involved in and say, listen, you need to be looking at this. Because it's I think it's fundamental. It's we're doing this for UK PLC.
Yes.
We want to improve our success ratio of ideas to exploitation, and I think if everyone's speaking the same language and has the metrics, not just blagging, not just like, oh, I need to get a proposal through, so I'm going to say I'm at TRL 3 and I'm going to go to TRL 6 and that'll be all right, and it shows up I thought about it. Just it's like just another analogy. I've got a young daughter. I'm trying to get her to swim more. She said this morning, "Oh yeah, Dad, I'll go swimming tonight for you." And I said, "You're not going swimming for me."
Yeah.
And that's the fundamental of this kind of stuff. When you're filling in a grant application, you're not doing it for the examiner.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
really great. So yeah,
But you're right. I mean, our interest in that Uday is a board member on the Research and Development Society. So they're looking at industrial strategy and stuff like that. And so our aim at that kind of level, at the UK level, is just to have a common language, have some common metrics, so everything sort of hangs together more. But you're right. I mean, we're delivering programs now, but our end game is to get these tools, and we're building web apps now of these tools that you just saw there, is to get more and more people using these tools so we can get more and more data, so we can feed back more insights. I mean, we've got insights based on 3,000 products going to market. We've got a bunch more data now, but you can imagine if we have lots of people, not us delivering all the programs, but all these, like ATI, lots of these different organizations using these sorts of tools, and we've got 3 million, 30 million products in there. How much more feedback are we going to get? And when we've got that tool like that navigator you've got there, where you can benchmark against, agri-food startups in the east of England, between here, I mean, we're going to be able to really help companies a lot more. And if you think once you have enough data, and then you get into the, AI machine learning area, which can guide back, that's where we want to get to. We want to get to more and more data in here to help more and more startups to succeed in the journey. Because it's, greater good and all that. Lots of the stuff, like you work in agri-food, people are trying to do good stuff in terms of the environment, in terms of all sorts of things. So if we can pull together and use this data for more than to succeed, we can ramp up that kind of impact. So,
and it's huge. It's huge. It's literally saving lives. And when I say saving lives, what I mean is, if you're on a hiding to nothing with an idea, do something else.
Yes,
we're so
absolutely
conditioned to think, oh, I've got to be a success, so therefore I've just got to plow on regardless. And it's a lot. Anyone who's done any entrepreneurship and tried to get a company off the ground, it's huge amounts of blood, sweat, and tears. And
it is.
And ideas are to a penny, but the right idea is not. And having this framework to know you're on the right track is priceless. And it's amazing the power of writing things down. When I first stopped working as an employee and sort of did some work as a consultant, I just wrote 3 objectives down, and I put them up on a pin board in front of my computer, and didn't really look at it. But I looked back 5 years later, and all 3 had been ticked off. At some point in that journey, they had been ticked off, and there's a subliminal guiding that comes from having written something down, and it means you make the right decisions when decision points are on. So I'm 100% bought in, Sam, and thanks very much for
no problem.
To me, really enjoyed that. And
really good talking to you again too. Enjoyed that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Good. Okay. Have a good day. See you later. Absolutely.